Okay, so I'd like to introduce Hannah Ray. Hannah is a journalist, social producer, and visual storyteller. She spent 3 years on Instagram's editorial team, and she now works with media brands as an Instagram editorial producer and community consultant. That includes Tate, the BBC. She's currently head of social strategy and storytelling for Vogue International, which is part of Condé Nast International, which is really what we're focusing on today. So just to kick off, Hannah, and welcome to Berlin and the snow and everything. Why was it that Condé Nast International wanted to invest in Instagram? What was the thinking behind it, the strategy?
Yeah, that's a good question to start with. So I was at Instagram working before and there for about 3 years in a high growth period. And one thing that was really apparent early on is that the fashion industry really saturated Instagram, like picked up on Instagram very early on. It was just something that went very well with fashion. It's super visual. A lot of people that worked in that industry just kind of got it. So a lot of fashion brands were quite early to adopt Instagram and were building their following quite quickly and engaging with people. And then sort of lots of new players popped up. So when Wolfgang Blau started the Condé Nast International project to try and bring some kind of digital revolution to some of the C&I titles and help them really future-proof for the digital future, he kind of looked at the Vogue Instagram account suite and said, how could we be better? Why are we not where Vogue should be?
So what were they doing
Instagram?
at that point, the point at which you'd have like joined?
So I came on board sort of in consultancy way to start just looking at the account suite and saying, okay, how could we be better? And this is really typical of traditional media publishers when they approach Instagram, is that they sort of start repurposing content from the website onto Instagram. So kind of cropping website images or repurposing video content, not really thinking of it as its own platform in its own right, that might require different kind of editorial thinking, different editorial teams. So that was the kind of thing that was the most apparent to me, is that they were just really almost broadcasting on Instagram and not treating it as a community platform that I knew it to be. And so that's where I kind of started to say, okay, there's actually a lot of low-hanging fruit here. There's a lot of things that we can do to really just elevate all of the Vogues internationally. So you might not know, but there's 22 Vogues across the world.
Right.
And those are the Vogue accounts that I'm in charge of thinking about our strategy for. And there was some really simple things that we could do to just start.
So when you got started, what were the sort of I guess the cultural challenges between how the editorial teams were thinking about content and how you knew, with your background on Instagram, would be effective? What were some of the, disconnects?
You've got 22 Vogue editors in 22 different countries, all with different approaches to Instagram, all thinking that perhaps the way that they use Instagram is the best way. So I think a lot of the work that I do is kind of mind shifting in a way. It's just, okay, let's try and think about Instagram in a different way to how you've been using it before. It needs to have different editorial approach, different thinking, different ways of creating content specifically for your community on Instagram. And a lot of that was just going back to some of the basics. Okay, what does your bio say? What does that say about who you are on Instagram? A lot of one-on-one calls with the Vogue editors to help them understand how are their teams set up, what's their password security like, and having those conversations help build a nice foundation. Then you can start talking about editorial content and what they want to do on Instagram and build up from there.
Now, I know that we spoke before that you feel that engagement is a really important part of building a community on Instagram. So how did you approach that with the Vogue audience?
Yeah, it kind of goes back to what I was saying about it's not a broadcast channel. I was on the community team at Instagram, and so Instagram has always been to me about community. It never was really a place for brands. It was actually an app that was created for individuals to share content with each other and was about discovering new people and commenting and liking and being part of a community. That's really hard for someone like a Vogue editor to think of, especially when it's always been a lot about looking in and not necessarily sharing everything behind the closed doors. So actually opening up those doors and letting people in. Really, I just tried to shift their minds to think much more about building communities, working with different online communities, and taking Vogue, which is a really brilliant legacy media brand with a lot of trust in some of its other channels, but taking it onto Instagram and saying, okay, how can we do this differently here that's going to engage with younger, different audiences that we can bring them into the brand as a whole and take them back to some of our other channels.
Okay, so what are some of the things that you did? I know you've got some visuals or some videos.
Yeah, let's click through and have a look. So some of the people who I think do community really well on Instagram, people like Refinery, Glossier, like they're basically bringing on individuals through the whole process. They invite them to events, they meet them face to face. It's worth checking them out, I think, in a separate time and going and having a look. I'm going to skip past this one. Some of the things that we talked about were actually working with the community, so not just kind of shouting at people and saying, we're Vogue, we're doing this, and talking about yourselves the whole time. It's actually highlighting great community players. So illustrators are a massive community on Instagram, and Vogue, super visual, there's a lot of fashion illustration. So it's a really simple idea, but for the Golden Globes, we asked one of the illustrators in the fashion community to come and illustrate some of the looks from the red carpet.
Okay, so that's the animation.
So this is
going,
one example, and we could produce that across 11 of the Vogue's Instagram stories. Another thing that we did was this Dear Vogue hashtag project. So I talk about hashtag projects a little bit, but essentially mobilizing the community around a certain theme, and this was for International Women's Day. And again, we invited community members to talk about items of clothing that made them feel empowered and this kind of thing.
Yes.
And then the last example, which is more about noticing what your community is doing already. When the new British Vogue cover came out, a lot of the community players were starting to create content to celebrate. They're essentially fans who are creating amazing content, and they're beautiful illustrators in their own right. So I noticed this and just said to the British Vogue, one of the team, I think we should celebrate that by simply speaking to them and seeing if they'd let us share their content on Instagram. And that's just a really simple thing that they do now every month, every time the cover comes out. So it's really just noticing how your community are engaging with you already and seeing if you as a publisher, as a brand, can maybe talk to them a little bit more on an individual level and celebrate their creativity.
Yeah, yes, I guess there's some interesting thoughts there. One is to listen or observe
exactly
to the community and not just broadcast.
Yeah.
And then I guess the other thing is encouraging people to be creative in their own right, rather than thinking you're the publisher, you've got a monopoly on creating content. And
it's also putting them on your platform. I think a lot of the brands that I see, especially media brands on Instagram, just talk about themselves or their own stories quite a lot. And actually making sure that you can give your community a voice and show that the people that you want to work with, they actually represent your brand, they can be your ambassadors for the brand, it gives them a platform. It's a really great way to build relationships with them.
Yes, yeah. So one other thing that we talked about was the kind of balance between what you put on Instagram stories and what you put on your feed. So how did you approach that across the different Vogues?
Skip through to another
Have you got,
slide.
sorry, you've got...
Yeah, so when we produce Instagram stories, we tend to tease the story with a video posted in feed. So these are a couple of examples. These are from our backstage series. So we do a Vogue backstage where we actually go and shoot the shows as they're happening backstage. But these kind of raw, ephemeral videos that are vertical in feed perform really well, and actually they increase engagement for us, and the stories and the feed posts work together in that way. So we'd often see, you can see in the caption there, it says, see more in our stories, and then people will go through and click through to the story and see a kind of a whole narrative. So actually taking your audience member from backstage to beauty looks, to hair, to actually the clothes hitting the runway.
Okay, so you kind of use them almost to sort of flag up content between the two.
Exactly, and I mean, Instagram's heavily investing in Instagram stories. They're releasing new sticker packs, it feels like, every week. It's a place where a lot of your audience members are going to be spending a lot of time, so it makes sense to invest a lot in Instagram stories, and that's where you begin to see people spending more time with your content, they're engaging with your brand, and then they're much more likely to see you in feed and start to engage with you there, if that makes sense.
Yes, yeah. So another thing we talked about was the importance of data and analytics. So I'm interested in kind of how you use that to, I guess, perhaps influence or persuade, the kind of content that the different Vogues are producing.
I mean, we look at data very, very carefully all the time. For example, with the last fashion month that just happened, after every fashion week, we would look at all the Instagram stories data from each story that we produced and actually go as granular as when did people exit the story, when did they tap forward, when did they tap back, and try and understand, okay, what types of clips are really engaging our audience, what kind of video content do they want, how can we make it snappier, more engaging, and keep people watching right through to the end. We look at completion rate, which you have to figure out yourself. You don't get that kind of insights from Instagram, but basically how many people watch from the first clip right the way through to the end. That's a really strong measure of how engaging your content is and whether people are spending time with you on Instagram and whether they want to come back. Yes. So it's really important for us to make sure that you're right at the front of that stories tray so that people actually come and see your content, they love it, and then they want to come back again and watch it.
So looking at that data, have you had some surprising results? And perhaps not surprising to you, but surprising to the editors about what works and what doesn't work?
Yeah, well, one of the things that was quite surprising to me was that we could create kind of what we call global stories, or produce stories centrally that I could share with all the Vogues, and that they would want to share, and actually all our audiences over the world would engage with that story on the different Vogue accounts. I never thought I would do that. I thought I'd always work with the individual editors to create local stories for them. But there were certain stories that actually all of the Vogue audiences globally wanted to see, certain kind of celebrities or Fashion Week stories. So that was surprising to me, and then I went even further into the data to find out what's the overlap between the followers for the different Vogue accounts, and found that it was minimal enough that it made sense for us to create global stories that we could put on every single account. And that's worked really well for us. It meant that we've kind of owned certain stories. You can imagine backstage, if you're Dior and you get a backstage story that goes out across 11 Vogues, how powerful that is, rather than it just landing on Vogue Paris or Vogue Spain, for example.
Yes.
I would love to show you some of the stories that we've done, because this might not make sense to people if I'm talking about it without actually seeing what we're talking about.
Have you got some on this?
I've got this video here. So this was the last fashion month. These stories were produced with 2 people going backstage, and then 1 central person in London sharing it out with all the Vogues.
Backstage at Burberry.
Tonight is Fun Fair in London.
We are here at the Mulberry Show.
Backstage at, gosh darn it, I was about to say we're backstage at Vogue.
So 11 million views, that's pretty impressive.
It's really nice to see this come together at the end, because it's quite scrappy the way it happens. You know, we have a couple of people backstage, they're sending in content, we're sharing it out with all the Vogue editors. And then with the power of 11 Vogues, we reach an audience of 11 million with just, I think we did 25 Instagram story packages, so not a huge amount. But we begin to really own these areas that Vogue should be owning. So the backstage access, the access to talent and celebrity, the first looks at the collections before they hit the runway, and actually having designers talking to us about the collections as well. So we have these kind of hashtags: Vogue First Look, Vogue Backstage, Vogue Plus One, that we begin to kind of
So it's that kind of
own.
Exclusive, money can't buy
Exactly, and I think
thing,
that's where we're at now. And a year ago, actually, it was a different story in trying to convince people we need to think about Instagram in a different way. We need to come up with new series ideas, new approaches, things that we've never done before. You'll notice that a lot of the videos are quite raw. They're shot in vertical, they're shot on iPhone, there's no fancy equipment. We sometimes give the models a phone. We want it to feel very playful. We want it to feel native to Instagram. We don't want it to look advertising.
So not too glossy, not too produced.
Yeah, it's still editorial content. We're still talking about the clothes and why it's different to last season and what's going on. And actually, we encourage the editors to always have some kind of editorial lens, so that it's not the same as our competitors' content. It's Vogue, exclusive content. But this is really quite a big shift from where we were last year, which was actually none of the Vogues were really creating Instagram stories at all.
So you work with 22 Vogues?
I work directly with 11 Vogue editors.
Okay.
And
11
then
is enough.
Through some other people, I reached 22. Yeah.
So what do you have to do in terms of, I guess, upskilling those teams in helping them to get the tone right? Because you can't do everything from your own team.
Yeah, so all their content, apart from sometimes when we come and add things centrally, is produced locally. So the Vogue teams actually have quite small teams in market. And what I do is really help on a more consultative advisory side. So, how are their teams set up to produce social content? How can they streamline their workflows better? What tools they might be able to use to kind of increase those workflows? So we have like lots of calls and chats about that. And then essentially they need to implement that. And so a lot of what I'm doing is helping them have the levers to increase the performance without actually going in and publishing content for them.
Yes.
If I just went in and hit publish, then our editors will never learn. So I think a lot of it is about helping them understand some of the theory behind it, but then really experience it for themselves, and that's where I've had the most success.
Yes.
Having the Vogue editors go and actually publish the content, see how well it performs, change the levers a bit, see how that impacts on performance, really help them look at data, talk to their teams, give them some video production skills, maybe do some training, some development. That's really where I've come in and tried to really elevate the Instagram game over the last year.
So what's been the kind of like the impact on the brand, on the audience of the project so far? I realise it's only a short period of time.
It's only a short period into it right now, but it's been very rewarding. It's a long game. I think there's sometimes with Instagram and social, editors have a tendency to want the short-term wins. And actually really putting in the due diligence and the community work will give you a much, much longer tail. We found that, we have UX research from before I started a year ago where people were saying things like, I don't think Vogue gets Instagram. And that's where I wanted to take us away from. And now we've been nominated for awards for our social content. We've had lots of, PRs, designers, anecdotally, audience members, community members come and saying, are you the guys doing the Instagram stories? We love them. We think Vogue has dramatically changed their game on Instagram. So a lot of that data is qualitative, but then we also have the numbers. We've doubled engagement in 6 months. Vogue India quadrupled their engagement last month. So, that's actually bucking a trend that a lot of other people are seeing where Instagram engagement is declining. So those two things together, the qualitative
so it's
and
kind
the
of the
data,
brand impact, but also the reach.
make me feel like we're going in the right direction.
Yeah.
So I feel pretty pleased about
Brilliant. Mike, we actually have 2 minutes, so we could take questions, or So.
Okay, if you have a question, then you know the drill. Raise a hand, and we have one right here. So the high-speed microphone is heading your way. Just let us know who you are and where you're from.
Hi, my name is Maria. I'm the Vice President of Content of Semana. It's a Colombian editorial group. We're working a lot on redesigning our Instagram strategies. We know it's very important for engagement, but my question is about monetization. Will it ever be monetizable, or is it just a piece where it's a great channel for people to engage with content and then have a follow-through to web pages or other channels where the content is distributed? Do you see monetization anytime soon?
I mean, I have seen it. A lot of the Condé Nast titles are, creating contracts and monetizing in different models, lots of different ways, and it's worth experimenting with them. I always talk to the editors and say, my role is on the editorial side, and I really want us to build a very strong relationship with the community so that if then we do want to actually have organic advertising or have some sponsored posts on the content, that's not going to take away a lot of the trust that we've built. So I always said, people wanted to come to me quite early on and say, we need to monetize this now, we need to do some more branded content. And actually I pushed back quite hard at the beginning and said, we're not in a very good place to do that just yet. We need to really build those community relationships. Instagram's about brand, engagement, getting people to discover us and find our content. And then, the kind of the different advertising models will come and they are developing. And I definitely know a lot of the Condé Nast titles, Italy, for example, are doing some really cool stuff with monetization. But I've always been quite hot on focusing on community and brand and engagement first, and then seeing what you can do with that. And some of the models are quite interesting. They're much more about, if you look at Refinery and the way that they're getting sponsorship for some of their events, where their Instagram community are attending, that's a little bit different to the normal kind of inventory or paid for content. So I would encourage you to maybe try different models and think about it a little bit differently.
No, very good.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. You have a question? Or
no, I'm fine.
No, we're fine.
I think
we're over
time
now.
is
Okay,
against us now.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you, Hannah.
Can I ask you please to
you.
thank our panelists? Thank you.